going to guess that there won't be anybody, or not more than one or two at most, in the church today who's ever heard of the Watt and Shan department store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And that's because for the last 30 plus years it hasn't existed. So if you didn't grow up there, you wouldn't probably know that. The only thing that would give it away is that it's engraved on the facade of a building in Penn Square in Lancaster City, where my wife and I both grew up. Not in the city, but in the county. So we're going in and out of the city on a regular basis. And like many stores, Watt and Shan is one that eventually failed, although it was a great success. You know, lots of small and medium-sized cities had their own department stores. Even small towns had their own department stores before the retail world that we know today really took hold, where you have big national chains that bought out the smaller folks. And before people's shopping habits changed, they didn't want to go downtown and have to park and walk on city streets. They wanted to go to the shopping malls that rose up in the 80s and later the outlet malls. And so although it had a run of over 100 years, Watt and Shan's ultimately failed and is no more in the world. But the building that they put on Penn Square is a beautiful building, and it's very obvious on one corner of that square where the common life of the city often gathers and takes place. It's a Beaux Arts style building, if you know what that means. And it's made out of this beautiful buff-colored brick they made locally. And on the main turn of the facade, it's rounded on the corner, not at a point. And it continues down along a courtyard, turns again, and then goes down the other block. It's like a giant W from the front if you looked at it with a drone. It's got 4 stories, and each story the windows get a little bit smaller and a little bit more ornate with these beautiful arched stone windows on the 4th floor. And there's reliefs between some of those levels with the sculptures of lions' heads and angels. And there's this beautiful stamped metal crown around the top of the building. But you don't know that it's a failed department store unless you know that history, because that's not what it is anymore. But it's still there because when Lancaster was going through its rejuvenation, when it had its renaissance, and leaders wanted to make sure that it was a place that it has become since. If you go there now, where people are flocking to live in the city, they're even building a retirement tower there, which is unthinkable from when I grew up there. There's stores, and there's galleries, and there's arts, and there's little quirky neighborhoods, and all kinds of wonderful things. And one of the pieces of that puzzle was when the J.W. Marriott Company decided to work with local partners and bring a convention center and hotel to Center City. And they selected the site of the Watt and Shan department store, which had been sitting empty for at least a decade. And they made an interesting decision. They didn't go with what was the least expensive or the most logical thing to do, which would have been to break out the wrecking ball and lay the thing flat and build the convention center they wanted to build. They understood the value, and the locals that were partners understood the value of what that building had meant for over a century. And so they erected girders and beams, and they held the front of the building in place while they tore off the back. And then they built up this new, beautiful hotel and convention center, but it still has that beautiful Beaux Arts structure that's now well over 120 years old, and still that visual impact from the center of its life. Everything has a season. We know that nothing lasts forever, and a business that made it 100 years in retail is remarkable. Most small businesses struggle to get through their first year. Even empires eventually fall, and another empire rises to replace them. And it's true for people too, where our lives are full of stories of failure, where we might have to recreate ourselves and redesign our life around a new way of being because whatever we were doing wasn't going to be possible to continue. So there's lots of stories in our human life and in the history of our world of people who fail before they succeed, or fail and never quite reach exactly what they intended. History's full of those stories. So you've got people that you know the story of, like Henry Ford, who failed before the Ford Motor Company was successful, and Thomas Edison, who famously didn't fail to make the light bulb 1,000 times. He learned how not to make a light bulb 1,000 times. You've got people like Winston Churchill, who embarrassed himself and failed at politics before ending up being the right person at the right place and time in history to be probably the one we point to save Western democracy in the lead up and during World War II. More recently, you could think of Steve Jobs. Whether you like him or not, whether you like his products or not, he almost killed his own company. They kicked him out, but he ultimately came back and was responsible for the iPhone that's in my pocket that causes iPhone addiction for many people nowadays, but also has some good sides to it as well. And if you know the story of J.K. Rowling, you know she didn't give up on her idea for a story about a young wizard after 12 rejections from publishing houses, and eventually she got a publisher and became very quickly one of the most read authors in history. So we have these moments of understanding that there's failure and sometimes success, and it's hard to determine how it is that we get to success and attain it. 5 or 6 years ago, a group of researchers and historians wanted to see if they could figure out what the magic sauce is for people and companies and businesses that manage to find success, because they know that so many people fail along the way. And many people end up giving up before they reach the point of success. So they studied a couple different groups of things as they did this research paper. They looked at people who submitted grants to the NIH. It's apparently very hard to get a grant to the NIH approved, and so you might have to apply multiple times if you were lucky enough to get one. Some organizations never got one. They looked at companies and people that invented things to see where they could from the history of the ones who tried and failed, the ones who got through, and putting together what the history to get to the point of giving up or the point of success looked for. And surprisingly, they looked at terrorists as well, because they learned it was the same dynamic. Even though it's a terrible and grim success that terrorists have on occasion, the good news is more often than not, they fail as well. And so some groups you never hear of, and some attempts we never hear of. And they studied the literature for those that have been grimly successful at murder and those who weren't. And they realized it's all about the same process. And it's not a gamble. It's not just luck that if you roll the dice enough times, your business, your property, your life is going to be perfect. It's not just about perseverance and hard work. It's actually a version of what Thomas Edison said, where he wasn't a failure all those times. He simply learned a way not to do things. Learning from failure is important, but not just any learning, the right learning and good learning from failure. What they discovered when they really dug in is that people who failed and threw everything in the trash can to start over from scratch were the most likely to continue failing and to never achieve success. That good learning from failure is the one that says, there's some good here that we can build off of. This part worked well. This theme or idea was worth keeping, and they built on it and expanded it and made it better rather than chucking the whole thing out. And the faster people could learn well what to build off of, instead of throwing it all away, the more likely they were and the faster they were to achieve success. Which is an interesting thing to consider on a day when the theme in our lectionary is around two intertwined ideas. One of God's call and the respond to God's call. And the second piece, which is sort of a sub-theme to that, is that in each of the stories in the lectionary today, the ones who are called are unworthy. They are failures in some sort as God calls them into action and puts them to work. So we heard the first lesson from Isaiah. This is a popular passage, especially at ordinations. If you've been to an ordination, pretty good chance you've heard it. It was read as the first lesson at my ordination 19 years ago, last week. And it's a story of Isaiah coming before the presence of God. He is not worthy. He is a sinner. He has unclean lips that would normally disqualify somebody from being in God's presence. But God doesn't use that as a disqualifier for Isaiah. Isaiah is the right person for the job. And so those seraphs are sent to take that burning coal and touch his lips and to make them clean and to blot out his sin. And now he can go do the important work God has for Isaiah to do. And it is quite a job in the midst of chaos. We get the clue about that from the beginning when it says that it was the year that King Uzziah died. King Uzziah reigned for over 50 years and was generally thought of as a good and effective monarch whose people prospered under his rule, even though he got a little shaky towards the end. But what happened next was a great period of uncertainty and danger for God's people. War was on the horizon and became their reality, and destruction was the issue as they were conquered by the Babylonian Empire. That is the chaos into which Isaiah raised his hand and said, "Sure, coach, put me in. I'll deal with that." We didn't hear it today, but it's in the lectionary for today in a passage that Paul has writing to the first letter Paul writes to the Corinthians, where he recaps the summary of the gospel about Jesus Christ, who gives us life and is the responsible party for helping us get beyond our sinfulness and finding new birth in God's grace and mercy. And he uses himself as his example to say, me of all people was unworthy for the gift of God's grace. Remembering, of course, that Paul was a murderer and persecutor of Christians before he met Jesus. But even he could be redeemed and turned around and repurposed into this incredible instrument of the gospel, who continues to be one of the most influential voices in Christianity. He was early on in those first centuries, and he still is today in so many ways. Admittedly unworthy and shouldn't have measured up when anybody was guessing who was going to reshape the world in the name of Jesus, but Paul ended up being the guy. And then in the Gospel of Luke today, we hear the calling of the first 4 disciples. Simon, Andrew, who's not named in this gospel, but we know as Simon's brother, he was his partner on the boat, and then their partner boat, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And it's kind of a passive calling of disciples in some ways compared to some other versions. There's a subtlety here. And although Simon's the only one who names it when he says, I am a sinner, I'm not worthy to follow you, we realize that they're all probably 3 failures in that, right? If you've been with fishermen and sailors, you can fill in the gaps and imagine what they might have been like. But it's subtle because Jesus doesn't have to be explicit at first in asking them to follow, when we can already see that Simon displays the truth of being a disciple given the simplest definition of what a disciple of Jesus is. And that simple definition is that a disciple of Jesus is the one who does what Jesus tells them to do. If you do what Jesus says, you're a disciple. And so as they pulled their boats up on shore after a night of fishing, and they've got to clean up and they've got to mend the nets and get them ready for the next day, it's no doubt they're tired. You're especially tired after a fishing trip that's a failure. You're always tired after a night of fishing. But when Jesus says, hey, why don't you put your boat out here in the water so I can teach? Simon knows there's something about him and says, sure, we can do that. And then when he's done teaching and he says to Simon, now I want you to go out into the deep water and put down your nets. Simon says, we fished last night and we didn't catch anything. He knows there's not going to be any fish out there this time of day. But because you want me to do it, I'll do it. He's acting like a disciple before he's even consciously made the decision to be a disciple. And we know how that turns out. What we see in the story is that Peter and the fishermen are called by Jesus to be his followers, and they do follow immediately when he says, when they get back to shore, come and follow me. They leave it behind, but that Jesus calling them is not starting from scratch with perfect human beings, as none of these stories of God's call are like that. But he recognizes he's calling fishermen with specific skills and experiences, and he's going to reshape that and reform that and use that to show them how to fish for people. Not to abandon everything they know and everything they were, but to reuse those gifts in a new and important way. And it's going to be a strain. We can hear the tension of that reality in the story because the nets are so full that they're singing under the strain, and that the boats can scarcely manage the catch. But they do, and they manage to get back to shore. And they're going to need that abundance of Jesus when Jesus asks them to do something because of what he's asking them to do. And Luke gives us a little clue about that we don't hear in our English translation. That's, you hear that a lot from preachers, but a lot goes over our head when we read Scripture in English. And one of them in this passage is that when we hear that Jesus says, put out into the deep water, there's a certain word that he's using for the deep waters of the Sea of Galilee or Lake of Gennesaret. It's the same body of water. It's a word that people who were familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures in Greek and the Septuagint would have heard, and they would have recognized it, for instance, right away in the story of creation, when the Spirit hovers over the deep and brings order out of chaos. That sense of deep water is a warning about the chaos of the world that God is always struggling to bring into order and sending prophets and people to do the work to help show how God's order can take hold in a chaotic world. And so these fishermen aren't just invited to put down their nets and leave their boats. That's enough, but there's an indication that they're being invited into something full of uncertainty, where the future will not be guaranteed. And it'll probably be a little bit of a wild ride. And there is no sense they had any idea what they were really going to walk into as they walked away from the shore and followed Jesus. And so the question for the church today, when we hear themes of call and worthiness and being equipped and being restructured, is what are the ways in which we are called to put our nets down into the deep waters of the chaos of the day that we find ourselves in? And granted, some days are more chaotic than others. Some seasons are more chaotic than others. Goodness knows we're in an era where it seems like there's an awful lot of wrecking balls flying around, and that things that we took for granted or our parents took for granted are suddenly up for grabs and debate. And for some people who have dissatisfaction with today, the answer is to tear it all down and start from scratch, which we already know is not necessarily a recipe for success. It's easy to point fingers and call out failure and say that things are dying or need to die. We talked about it a couple weeks ago in terms of our own tradition, where people swear and have been swearing for decades that the church is dying and will die. And hopefully we've covered enough ground to realize change is not death, but that's what's going on. That the world is changing, the church is changing, and it always has. It just doesn't always change as quickly as we've seen it within a few decades. But other Christians have certainly lived through decades where it changed quickly in the past. It does not mean death. And we look at other institutions that certainly have not been as successful as we wanted, and we look at them and say, yeah, we can't keep doing things the same way because there's an element of failure here, and we need to name that failure. But this is a season for recognizing it's not about tearing down and throwing away, but about fighting for the things that are worth saving and building upon the things that are good and the ideas that we hold dear and strengthening them to become more of what they're called to be and more of what they can be. Like those nets that really weren't made for holding the number of fish that they ultimately were called upon to drag up to shore, but they managed to do it. Or if you still go to Penn Square in Lancaster City today, you're still going to see that beautiful facade of the Wat and Shan department store, only now it's not the front of a 4-story department store, it's a 20-plus story thriving hotel and convention center. And the question is, if we can figure out the things to keep and to build onto, what will God do through God's abundance with those that might make them seem completely outsized with what we have the vision to see today? But are we able to be brave enough to retool and to see them to their fruition? We do not want to be people of facades only. We don't want to hold on to the things that look a certain way because we like the way they look, and we don't care if what's behind falls away or gets torn down. As long as everything looks okay, it'll be okay. That's not what this is about either. It's about rebuilding behind those facades which carry the history and the themes and the important parts of who we are and who God intends us to be, and filling that out for a new generation and a new day to be as effective as we can. And it is not easy work. And it is not easy for us as individuals to hear that call into a chaotic world and say, put me in, coach, I will do it. But it's on offer nonetheless. We have a baptism this morning, as most of you have probably discerned on your way through the door. When we baptize infants, there's not much yet in the life of an infant that we can say exactly who they're going to turn into and what they're going to be. But we know when we baptize an adult, let's say, that being baptized into Christ and the church as we understand it does not erase everything that came before. We do hear, as we hear throughout the scripture today, it blot out our offenses, it resets the stage in terms of our failures, but that we will always take the gifts that we have been given by God and employ them in our life in Christ in whatever way is unique to us. So we are all called upon to be fishers of men, whether we were fishermen before or not. And our net, so to speak, is really the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ, which is a story of redemption and life, a call to care for the vulnerable and to be outward focused and to put ourselves second and remember the unity that Jesus always intended for the body. And our net looks different based on our gifts and our history and our experience. And it will be no less stressful at times to hear what we used to know and the ways that we used to behave come under pressure of the weight of the burgeoning of God's kingdom, but we're asked to trust it anyway and to use whatever we can and to believe that it will hold and that 20-story abundance can be ours as well. So although we hear often about the death of institutions and the failure of the people who were responsible for them, the truth is everything is a failure on some level, and we're all failures on some level, and that is not the defining truth of the day. In a time of uncertainty, in a time of shifting sands, in a time where we feel that we're discouraged and disappointed and we're worried about the future and we don't see a way out of the things that seem to lock us in, that the truth is that it is God's abundance and God's call of us imperfect people and our imperfect structures who are willing to retool, who are willing to rethink and take the best of what we've experienced and know and turn it into something new that is our hope to achieve what God intends for the world. It really doesn't matter who we are or at what point we come to that point. That's the invitation. And so as we sail about in our boats and we find ourselves in deep waters and we seem surrounded by the threat of chaos, there is a message and a question coming across the waters to all of us. The same one that Isaiah heard, that we reheard this morning. Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?
Amen.